The evidence also showed that Fred Hampton was in fact killed with 2 bullets, parallel bullets, fired into his head at point-blank range. He wasn't killed with the bullets through the walls. But what we uncovered was that the FBI had obtained a floor plan of Fred Hampton's apartment. That floor plan was complete with all the furniture, including the bedroom where Hampton and Johnson slept, and a rectangle showing the bed. And it turned out that this FBI informant, William O'Neill, and his control took that floor plan and gave it to Hanrahan's raiders before the raid, so that they came in knowing the layout, knowing where Fred would be sleeping. And when we looked at the directions of the bullets, in fact, they converged on the bed where Fred Hampton was sleeping that morning.
As I recall, a lot of the bullets were shot from the floor below as well as they were.
No, they were the front door and the back door, and then they took one of the machine gun and stitched the wall in the front, and that went through all of the bedrooms in the apartment.
And the role of the FBI and of COINTELPRO, the FBI's massive program against dissidents in the United States. How did you uncover that as well?
Well, first there was a burglary at the Media, Pennsylvania FBI office, in which some draft dodgers uncovered that there was this program that talked about, basically talked about disrupting, destroying, and neutralizing the Panthers by any means necessary. And one of their objectives was prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the black masses. Fred Hampton, at 21, was a tremendously charismatic and powerful figure in Chicago. He could talk to welfare mothers, gang kids, and he could talk to law students and college students. He had the ability to pull people together. You got a little glimpse of that in what the clip that you saw. But he made people believe in themselves. He made people feel powerful, and that they could bring about change. And that was his real threat. And so we knew there was this program to prevent the rise of a messiah. We knew about the floor plan. Then we uncovered a document that they gave the informant a bonus after the raid because his information was invaluable to the success of the raid. So internally, the FBI actually took credit for this raid, for the results that Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were killed.
Talk about Willie O'Neill.
William O'Neill was he was uncovered because he became a witness in another case. And I guess we all knew William O'Neill. He was a very flamboyant person, and I guess my idea of an informant was somebody who sits quietly in the corner and takes mental notes. That was not William O'Neill. He was a provocateur. He built an electric chair that was supposedly to threaten potential informants in the party when he was an informant. He attempted to build what he called a rocket that would go from the Panther office to City Hall until Fred Hampton...
Explain his position in the Black Panthers.
He was the chief of security, and at one point he was Fred Hampton's bodyguard. And he was present the night of the raid and left. And there was evidence that Fred Hampton was drugged, and he's never admitted it, but some of that evidence suggests that O'Neill was the one who drugged him the night of the raid.
I want to ask, just play for a minute, get your response to Cook County State's Attorney Edward Hanrahan. After the raid, he repeatedly claimed the Panthers had opened fire on the police. This is how he described what happened.
The immediate, violent, criminal reaction of the occupants in shooting at announced police officers emphasizes the extreme viciousness of the Black Panther Party. So does their refusal to cease firing at the police officers when urged to do so several times.
That was Ed Hanrahan, the Cook County State's Attorney. Your response to him, and also what happened to Hanrahan as you sought to pursue the truth of the murder of Fred Hampton?
When we gathered the evidence, and you can tell which way a bullet enters from the smaller hole and exits with a larger hole and the wood splayed outward, it became clear that, as I said, 90 shots came in, and at most one, a vertical shot, went out. The Panthers were smart enough to invite the community in. The police never sealed it. And the black community, which had been divided on the Panthers, was not divided on the fact that a young man was murdered in his bed, a young leader, at 4:30 in the morning. So there was a tremendous reaction. And Hanrahan became defensive and told the story that you just saw. And later on, he even went further and said, well, Fred Hampton personally was firing at the police. And he gave the Chicago Tribune a photograph. The photograph had 2 black dots on it, and he says, these are the gunshots that Fred Hampton fired. We invited the press out there. It turns out those dots were nail heads. And I think that was the beginning of the end of Edward Hanrahan. He never got elected to anything again. Even a Republican was elected state's attorney of Cook County, which was unheard of. He ran for mayor, he ran for congressman, and basically his political career ended on December 4th, just at the time when he thought it would rise.
I want to talk about the overall context with Jeffrey Haas, but in 1969, you were one of the leaders of the Columbia student protest, one of the founders of the Young Lords. What was the effect 40 years ago today? Where were you on this day? I remember very well the news coming about Fred Hampton's death. And, of course, as you mentioned, his ability to unite people. Very few people are aware that Fred Hampton was the original creator of the concept of the Rainbow Coalition that a young Jesse Jackson then adopted later, because he was building unity between the Black Panthers and the Young Lords and some white radical organizations in Chicago, and he called them the Rainbow Coalition, which is what Jesse then adopted into as his main program. But he had this ability to unite all kinds of different groups, as you say, racial groups, as well as across economic lines. And in terms of the legacy of Hampton, obviously Bobby Rush, who later became a congressman in Chicago, still is a congressman. What has been in Chicago the way that the political establishment has dealt with the reality of this assassination and of the historical impact of Fred Hampton?
Well, I think for one thing it marked the independence of the black political leaders in Chicago, who had up until then had been pretty much lackeys of the mayor and the Democratic machine. And a young state senator named Harold Washington spoke out, and Danny Davis spoke out, and Jesse Jackson welcomed Bobby Rush. And all of a sudden you had an independent and much more progressive black political machine, or part of the machine that was independent. And I think that group and white liberals were given credit for eventually electing Harold Washington mayor as Chicago's first black mayor. Of course, there's also the legacy that without a young leader, I think the west side of Chicago degenerated a lot into drugs. And without leaders like Fred Hampton, I think the gangs and the drugs became much more prevalent on the west side. He was an alternative to that. He talked about serving the community, talked about breakfast programs, educating the people, community control of police. So I think that's unfortunately another legacy of Fred's murder.
And Jeff Haas, you talk in the book also about how you, a white radical raised in the South, ended up in Chicago that day as part of the People's Law Clinic there, working with the Panthers. Could you talk about your own trajectory and how you got involved in this story?
Well, I grew up in the South. I came from a progressive family, but also it was a segregated South, and I think being a white person there, we all accommodated ourselves in some way to segregation. I think it made cowards of us all. When I got to Chicago, I was influenced by what was going on nationally. Chicago was sort of the hub of all this political activity. You had the Democratic Convention there. Dr. King had marched there. You had the conspiracy trial starting. You had the National Office of SDS. All the forces were converging, and I was very much moved by the Black Power movement, the Civil Rights movement. So we wanted to be lawyers for the people. We wanted to be, so we started the People's Law Office in a sausage shop. And I think we started it with a sense of collectivity. So it wasn't just me. There were 4 or 5 of us who from the get-go worked together. And our mandate was to expose the murders, who the killers were of Fred Hampton. We did not know that it would take us to J. Edgar Hoover and John Mitchell and the seat of government. But of course it turned out that way. And the more we dug and the more we uncovered, the more interested we got, and the more we realized that this was a national program. Some people have compared Hanrahan's group to sort of a local hit squad, and but was utilized by the federal government and by Hoover. And I think, unfortunately, or not surprisingly, no one has ever done a day of time for the murder of Fred Hampton, for that raid. So I think another legacy is to try to hold our government officials accountable. And interestingly enough, when the Church Committee in the 70s began to investigate COINTELPRO as well as Watergate, it was Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld, Ford's chief aides, who opposed any kind of exposure of this illegality or any kind of restraint on the intelligence committees.
We have to leave it there. I want to thank you very much for being with us, Jeffrey Haas. Assassination of Fred Hampton is his book, How the FBI and the Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther.